The explosions in the apartment houses in 1999 in the cities of Bayansk, Moscow, and Volgodonsk, and the related incident in Ryazan are among the most mysterious events of Russian history, and naturally among the most important ones. Who blew up Russia back then? Terrorists or the Federal Security Service, the FSB? After the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, this question resounded with new force. And after the devastating terrorist attacks on the Crocus Concert Hall in March 23 and 2024, where at least 133 people were killed and hundreds wounded, people are asking once again who is really behind the terrorist attacks in Russia and why they keep happening. This topic is impossible to understand, especially for those outside Russia, without understanding the historical context. Let's recall the First War in Chechnya, a southern mountainous autonomous region of Russia which ended in 1996. The First Chechen War was between Chechens who wanted to live independently from Moscow on the one hand and the Russian army on the other. It was a bloody war unleashed by President Boris Yeltsin to raise his own ratings before elections, and essentially ended in defeat. The Kosovo Agreement, named for the town in Chechnya where they were signed, involved the withdrawal of Russian forces from Chechnya. Soon after the First War, a second war broke out in Chechnya, a civil war between Chechens, those who adhered to their traditional Chechen form of Islam, which was less strict, and those who called themselves followers of pure Islam. They called for the return of the canonical faith of the era of the Prophet Muhammad, and to obey Sharia law. They wished to live according to Islamic law, not the secular law. Adherents of pure Islam in the North Caucasus after the First Chechen War rapidly increased. Some believed that Sharia law would put an end to the lawlessness reigning in Chechnya for many years. Believers in pure Islam saw it as the only opportunity to develop themselves in this impoverished region. But the Chechen field commanders, the so-called leaders of Chechen armed formations who fought Russian forces, exploited people's spiritual quests for their own purposes. The field commander Shamil Basayev, for example, proclaimed that they had to fight the godless Russians in order to unite the Caucasus into one Sharia state from the Caspian Sea to the Black Sea. From all over the North Caucasus, people who believed in radical ideas traveled to Chechnya. Field commanders Basayev and Katab trained them in special camps to become fighters. But there was no sign of any Sharia law. Chechnya became a getaway for the transit of narcotics from Central Asia to Russia. The drug traffickers would kidnap people, including from neighboring Russian regions, and bring in lots of cash. The Chechen people quickly tired of all this. They wanted conciliation. In 1997, they elected Aslan Muskatov as the head of government in Ichkeria. That's what Chechens themselves called Chechnya. It tried to combat radical ideology, but failed to stop the banditry and fundamentalism in this country. Ultimately, he himself was killed in clashes with FSB forces in 2005. Now, how did Moscow react to the successive waves of violence in Chechnya over the years? The Kremlin's response has been surprising. In fact, the authorities seem to do everything to aggravate the situation and find new reasons to send in troops. The government loudly denounces the kidnapping of people by Chechen insurgents, but the border with Ichkeria remains practically open. Chechens didn't have long to wait before the situation escalated. In March 1999, Chechen terrorists on orders from Katab staged a terrorist attack on the marketplace in Vladikavkaz, the capital of neighboring northern Ossetia. And in August, about 500 fighters led by Basayev and Katab invaded Dagestan next door. They seized several villages and declared an Islamic state on the territory of the Republic. The Kremlin was completely at a loss. Then Prime Minister Sergei Stepashin announced that Russia had apparently lost Dagestan for good. But then Vladimir Putin appeared on the political scene. Prior to these events, he had been completely unknown, serving anonymously in the KGB in Eastern Germany, then later as a bureaucrat in St. Petersburg, and then director of the FSB. The crisis in the Caucasus helped Putin to win his initial popularity. People were tired of the elderly and sick Yeltsin, exhausted by the upheavals of the 1990s, and yearned for a strong hand. On their TV sets, people saw saw Putin extending the strong hand to them. He promised that Dagestan would remain within Russia. He flew to the Republic and inside a military tent drank like a real man alongside the Dagestani militia who were fighting the Chechen rebels. Everything was captured by the television cameras. By the end of August, with the help of locals, Russian army had forced the Chechen fighters out of Dagestan. Russian Air Force and artillery were unleashed in the special operation, as it was called. Russian planes flew over Chechen territory, with the military first saying that they were chasing the retreating fighters, then that they were bombing their bases in Chechnya. And the war was imminent, a war no one wanted. Ordinary Chechens did not want it. They did not want to answer for the actions of radicals. And Russians didn't want it, since they remembered how only a few years ago soldiers returned from Chechnya in zinc coffins. But now something happened in Russia which radically changed people's attitude towards war. On September 4th in 1999, in the city of Bayansk, a truck exploded near a building which housed families of military personnel in the 136th Motorized Rifle Brigade. About 3 tons of explosive had been placed in the vehicle, and the results were catastrophic. 64 people were killed, 23 of them children. Security forces were able to defuse a second truck set to detonate near a hospital. The terrorist attack in Bayansk was only the beginning. On September 8 in 1999, there was an explosion in a 9-story apartment building in Moscow on Goryanova Street, killing 100 people. Citing FSB officers, media reported that a mixture of TNT had exploded and that the explosives were placed on the ground floor of the building in a space rented by a certain Mukhitlai Panov. Remember his name. The government declared September 13th as a day of mourning for those killed in the explosions of Bayansk and on Goryanova Street in Moscow. But that same day, another bomb went off in an 8-story apartment building in Moscow on Kashirska Highway. The brick building was utterly destroyed and nearly all its inhabitants, 124 people, were killed. This building contained a furniture store, whose owner had rented the space to the very same Mukhitlai Panov from the first tragedy as a sugar storehouse. And on September 16 in the city of Volgodonsk in Rostov region, the 4th and the last such terrorist attack took place. A truck parked next to a 9-story residential building exploded, killing 19 people. The field commanders reacted very strangely to these events. Shamil Basayev denied his involvement in the terrorist attacks, but said that Dagestanis had organized the explosions in revenge for the Russian army's military operation in Dagestan. Then later, he denied his claim. A day before the explosion on Kashirska Highway, in an interview with the AP, Khattab said that Russia should prepare for explosions in its cities and swore that these explosions would indeed occur. But soon he, too, would deny his involvement in the attacks on the apartment buildings, stating that his fighters were not like those who kill sleeping civilians with bombs and shells. Even so, the Russian media actively reported Chechen involvement in the explosions. TV News described how ID papers belonging to one of Khattab's close associates were found in the defused truck in Bayansk. Interfax reported that the certain person with a Caucasian accent had called their agency's editorial office and said that the explosions in Bayansk and Moscow were their answer to the bombing of civilians in villages in Chechnya and Dagestan. Citing investigators, the media also reported that the leader of a terrorist group called Karachayev Jamaat, connected to Khattab, had used ID belonging to Mukhitlai Panov. For most Russian people, everything was obvious. The buildings had been blown up by terrorists from the Caucasus. Putin was constantly on the TV screen. He said that the apartment bombings were a challenge not to the government, but to the Russian people, and vowed to drown the terrorists in toilets.
В аэропорту, значит, вы уж меня извините, в туалете поймаем и в сортире их замочим, в конце концов. Все, вопрос закрыт окончательно.
His ratings grew. If, in August, when he was only prime minister, less than a third of the population approved of his activity, by September, more than half did. That was how the Russian government obtained a mandate from the people for war. And on September 13 and 99, Russian forces entered Chechnya. By March, Putin, the savior of the nation from Chechen terror, won the presidential elections. Meanwhile, there's a subject running parallel to this entire story, which to this day provokes numerous justified questions about the possible involvement of the FSB in the apartment explosions. Supposedly, the establishment needed a pretext to launch the Second Chechen War and bring Vladimir Putin to power. Gennady Seleznov, the Speaker of the State Duma, leader of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation and a member of the Security Council, made a comment widely covered in the media, Several hours after the explosion of the apartment on Kashirskaya Highway, at a plenary session of the State Duma, Seleznov said that according to his source, a building in Volgodonsk had exploded. When the terrorist attack really did take place in Volgodonsk, Vladimir Zhirinovsky, leader of the conservative Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, demanded in his usual obnoxious manner that Seleznov explain himself, and his microphone was turned off. Later, Seleznov told Rossiyskaya Gazeta that in fact he meant another incident on September 12 near a building in Volgodonsk when a homemade bomb went off. This wasn't a terrorist attack, but a clash of local gangs, and there were no fatalities. Supposedly, that was the explosion Seleznov meant in his speech in the State Duma. But in 2017, in an interview with vlogger Yuri Dud, Zhirinovsky recounted that a misunderstanding had occurred. Supposedly, the FSB knew that a group of terrorists had come to Volgodonsk to prepare an attack, and Seleznov reported about this tip as an event that had already occurred. Quite a few questions have been raised by an incident involving our colleague, Major Vyacheslav Izmailov, a journalist at Novaya Gazeta. On September 8, 12 hours before the explosion on Guranova Street, Izmailov received information about the impending attack. He immediately turned it over to the Chief Directorate to Combat Organized Crime, known by its Russian acronym GUBOP. Despite Izmailov's warning to GUBOP, security officials did not prevent the terrorist attack. Even before the explosion of the apartment building, multiple media outlets said Russian authorities themselves were preparing the terrorist attacks in Moscow. Yes, at that time, such things could still be written. In June 1999, journalist Jan Blomgren wrote that the Kremlin planned to stage terrorist acts which could be blamed on the Chechens. Journalist Alexander Zhilin, in an article for Moskovsky Komsomolets, said the presidential administration was planning to stage terrorist acts, or attempts at terrorist acts, and was looking at a possibility of having people kidnapped supposedly by Chechen fighters. But the strangest part of the story took place in the southern city of Ryazan. After explosions in the buildings in Bayansk, Moscow and Volgodonsk, Russians were in a panic. Half the people in the country lived in multi-story dwellings like those attacked, and everyone was frightened, expecting the next terrorist attacks. People organized watches and checked car parks nearby. On the evening of September 22, Alexei Kartofelnikov, a resident of Ryazan, who lived in a building on Novosolo Street, noticed a Zhiguli near the entrance of his building, with paper covering the license plate. 3 men and 2 women were unloading sacks of some kind out of the car and taking them into the basement of the building. Kartofelnikov called the police. The police took 40 minutes to arrive, and by that time, the people in Zhiguli had managed to leave. The officers found 3 sacks in the basement containing an unknown substance. Soon, the top regional security officials had coverage on the building. Residents were evacuated. A field analysis conducted with a gas analyzer by specialists from the Ryazan Interior Ministry indicated the presence of hexagon vapors in the substance. Upon examination of the contents of the sack, the experts found an electronic watch, 3 batteries connected by wires, and a detonator, a cartridge from a hunting rifle, filled with gunpowder. The timer on the device was set for 5:30 a.m. Sappers disabled the detonator and timer. The substance from the sacks was sent to Moscow, and the local FSB reported the successful prevention of a terrorist attack and opened a criminal case on an attempt at terrorism. Law enforcement closed all the entrances and exits from Ryazan. Federal TV channels showed sketches of 3 suspects, 2 men and a woman, and reported the aborted terrorist attack. On September 23, Putin announced that an explosive device had been discovered in the sacks thanks to the vigilance of Ryazan residents, and promised to wage war against the terrorists to the end. On September 24 at 12 noon, Vladimir Putin, head of the Interior Ministry, spoke at a meeting of officials saying the terrorist attack was prevented. But half an hour later, something inexplicable happened. Nikolai Patrushev, director of the FSB, who today holds the post of Secretary of the Security Council, one of the persons closest to Putin, was also present at the ministry meeting, and in an interview with the NTV journalist said no terrorist act was prevented in Ryazan. Rather, the FSB was holding exercises, and there wasn't hexagon in the sacks, but sugar. It's just that the secret police worked very clumsily and everyone thought they were terrorists. And that's how it turned out as it did. So it turns out that the FSB conducted an exercise in a residential area, and no one knew about these exercises. Neither the local authorities, the police, or even local FSB. Their reaction, by the way, was harsh. And they put out a statement. Quote, "As has become known, the placement of an imitation explosive device discovered on September 22 was part of an inter-regional exercise. The report of this was unexpected for us and followed when the FSB director discovered the addresses of the persons in the city of Ryazan involved in the placement of the explosive device, and their detonation was being prepared." End of quote. In the year 2000, NTV broadcast a discussion between residents of the affected apartment building in Ryazan and representatives of the FSB. We can't imagine such a thing nowadays. People ask the secret police a reasonable question: who allowed them to perform such experiments on people? They didn't believe the security officials claimed that this was an exercise. For example, Alexei Kartofelnikov, the very resident of the ill-fated building on Novoselov Street, who had called the police, said that the substance in the sacks was granulated like finely chopped vermicelli and didn't seem like sugar. The question remains open regarding the former chief of the Moscow FSB, Yevgeny Sevastyanov, who criticized his colleagues on the TV show. Officials did not produce a plan for the exercises, nor the order given to their alleged deployment, even to deputies of the State Duma. In fact, it was after the incident in Ryazan that extremely persistent version of the story was born, that the FSB blew up Russia to whip up an atmosphere whereby Putin would appear to be the savior of the nation from terrorists and could win the elections. In the opinion of the advocates of this version, the next terrorist attack after Volgodonsk was supposed to be Ryazan, and only due to a fortunate coincidence, this didn't happen. The story of the involvement of Putin and the FSB in the terrorist attacks was first laid out in detail in the book The FSB Blows Up Russia, written by Yuri Felshtinsky, a historian at Rutgers University, and Alexander Litvinenko, a former FSB officer. The FSB Blows Up Russia was published with funds donated by Boris Berezovsky, who at that time opposed Putin. For many years, Litvinenko and Felshtinsky kept finding new arguments to support the version that in fact the apartment buildings were blown up in 1999 by the secret police. In 2006, Litvinenko was poisoned in London. A British court concluded that Litvinenko was murdered in a special operation by the FSB, likely personally approved by Patrushev and Putin. Litvinenko's death further confirmed that supporters of the version whereby the FSB blew up the buildings were right. To be sure, Felshtinsky is fortunately alive, unlike others who've spoken out about the explosions. Even so, there are still lots of inconsistencies in the story of the FSB's involvement in the terrorist attacks. It is curious how much Russian people don't trust their own government, which can be understood. How can people be sure that Putin didn't blow up the apartment buildings back then, if he's a monster who constantly lies? People's distrust in the government and the realization that it isn't reliable, but can't stab you in the back, drag you to the draft board while you're out jogging, and jail you for a social media repost. These are the real reasons for the extreme persistence of the story that the FSB blew up Russia. Whether this was true or not, you and I will certainly find out in the future. The time will come when the secret archives will once again fly open, just as in the early 1990s, and much of what we can't even guess about will be made public. To be continued.